We just finished the kickoff workshops for the first Somali justice system strategy. The kickoff workshops were meant for the core team, and as such, they were meant to prepare them for the process ahead. Today, I wanted to share with you how exactly I designed the process and what went into each of the 4 days. Come along. As I mentioned, the workshops were designed for 4 days, so now I'll walk you through each and every one of them. Day 1, as you can see, was focused on team setup and goal alignment. It was quite important as we met in a group that had very different levels of understanding of what the process entails. Some of the colleagues were already well aware of the details of the process. Some were very new to it, and yet they were very important because they represented different institutions under the justice system or the security system. So we had the police, the prosecutor, attorney general, of course, the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs and their representatives. We have colleagues from international organizations and so on. So let's go through day 1. We started off with questions about the goal. And they were questions about both the goal of the process. Most likely we will finish our work towards the end of 2024. And so we wanted to understand what characteristics should we look for in terms of a successful strategy. We talked a lot about legitimacy. We talked about the fact that we don't want an old school traditional strategy, but the one that recognizes the system, that is focused on learning and adapting. In that way, it allows us to be inclusive, very in tune with what's going on in the country, but also what's happening in the broader international context. And so that was our first part of the workshop. What's the goal? What do we want to achieve towards the end of 2024? But of course, this is just part of a bigger picture. So we took some more time to discuss the broader goal. Why do you even do this strategy? What does it bring? What does it help with in terms of a bigger transformational goal? What is it that we actually want to see for the justice system in Somalia? If we get there, how does it feel? How does it function? So we spent some time trying to understand that, but at the same time, we talked about the fact that this broader vision is something that is only now emerging and that is going to be emerging throughout the entire process. And so once we discussed these shorter and more long-term goals, we moved to starting to understand us as a team. And for that, I used a concept coming from Nesta, which breaks down the 4 skills and key attitudes that an innovation team, especially in the public sector, should have. We spent some time on self-reflection, trying to understand which of the skills we already have in the room, who's strong in which of these, but also what skills do we see as critical for the process and yet not really there? What are the skills that we would like to develop moving forward? Perhaps finding some space in the entire process to actually work on these skills. This was quite an interesting exercise, and I think the team had some really good reflections, self-reflections, that provided insights for the following days. So this is how the day 1 went. And I said that at the beginning of day 1, and I still recognize that these types of initial exercises and discussions, they feel fluffy. They feel not that heavy, not that important, and yet they hold some very, very heavy bearing on the entire process. So whenever you're designing a process like that, don't skip them. Don't make them just superficial and short. You really need to go deep, and you really need to start asking some questions that at the beginning might be quite uncomfortable. Now, day 2. Day 2 and day 3, these were the 2 most heavy in terms of the substance days. These were the days when we started talking about systems thinking and foresight, which is the core of our process. These 2 methodologies are meant to inform the next several months and even beyond. And so on day 2, we started with understanding systems thinking. And call me old school, but for that, discussion and for understanding what do we actually mean by systems thinking and why would that be important, I really like to go back to the Kinevin framework developed by Dave Snowden. And so we started discussing this matrix that comes from his work. We talked about the breakdown of different processes, problems, challenges, from obvious or simple up until complex or chaotic. And so we were trying to understand what that means for our process and what questions should we be asking as we move along. We talked about different examples of systems thinking being used by governmental agencies, different international organizations, NASA, academia, and so on. I really wanted us to get comfortable with that methodology, also in the sense that there are others who have used that. And so we're not testing something unproven. We're not working with something that has never been tested. It has. And we have some solid examples that that type of an approach can bring some really interesting results. We then discussed how our process would go based on the systems thinking approach. And then we moved to our first exercise of the day. And the first task was to map a system, but I deliberately asked that we do not map a system that is a justice system. Just pick any other system, pick any specific social problem, social issue, and map a system around it, but let's keep justice for the next day. I did this deliberately because I didn't want us to really start diving deep into how we understand the justice system. That I saved for the next day. I wanted us to really experience the process of looking for connections, to really get in the groove of systems thinking rather than immediately jumping into the justice system. And I tend to do that when I'm teaching something new. Sometimes it's easier to focus on something different than the core topic that your team wants to handle, just because the mechanics of that exercise could be more easily understood when you're not too focused on the topic that you want to explore. You're just playing with the method. Once we finished our maps, we went to another part of the session, which was focused on understanding the relationship between systems thinking and foresight. And the two go very much hand in hand. You cannot really tell them apart, although there are practitioners who do systems thinking without looking into futures. In this case, we're combining the two methodologies. In fact, as you will see, we're actually choosing one of the foresight methodologies to be the lead, the guide for our process moving ahead. Naturally, we discussed the fact that we cannot really predict everything. That's not what we really want to achieve with foresight. So we talked about the so-called foresight zoo, different phenomena or events that cannot really be predicted, but are important to keep in mind when we analyze the context, both in the present and then in hindsight. Finally, we went through some of the tools that we will be using throughout the process that will be more on the supportive end. And so we will be doing horizon scanning. And to do that, we discussed a little bit the difference between environmental scanning, which is quite typical for strategy development. We then talked about horizon scanning, which is something that we'll embrace a bit more in our process. And so I walked the team through the steps that we will be taking. I invited everyone who is interested in being the core team for horizon scanning to sign up. And so we will be doing regular check-ins and regular reflections so that we start analyzing the broader system, we start identifying weak signals of change. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about horizon scanning, I will link my video about it below. Day number 3, 3 horizons. This is the core methodology that I selected for this process of preparing the first Somali justice system strategy. And I did this for a reason. Three horizons, in my experience, is one of the foresight methods that has the biggest potential in terms of bringing different stakeholders on board and generating more reconciliatory dialogues. In Somalia, there are several justice systems. We do not only have the official one, the one that is governed by the Ministry of Justice. We also have a traditional justice system. There is a religious justice system. So we need to find a way of having these systems speak with one another, recognize one another, and organize the entire structure so that at the end of the day, it benefits the citizens. Before we jumped into the methodology of Three Horizons, we started the day with the justice system map. Colleagues had the time to reflect a little bit on the content of the previous workshop. And so now we were ready to start mapping the justice system as we understand it, sitting there as the core team. We split into two groups, and each of the groups were trying to put on paper an illustration of what that system consists of and what are some of the relationships that we should pay attention to from their perspective at this point when we're designing the strategy. And so we started with that, which also allowed us to discuss areas of intervention, this levers of change that will allow us to make the strategy something that is a learning mechanism rather than just a set of KPIs spread over 5 years that never change. Once we discussed that, we moved through the Three Horizons methodology. I will not be going through the entire thing with you right now. If you're interested in learning more about this methodology, just drop me a comment below. I'm happy to record another video that describes that in more detail. For now, the key thing that you need to know is that we discussed each of the horizons one by one, and we talked about how exactly are we planning to unpack these scenarios. What type of methods are we going to be using? There will be consultations, there will be horizon scanning, there will be elements of positive deviance research that we will be using mostly to define Horizon 2. And so we had that discussion for a big part of the day. Once we finalized that, we moved to our very first actionable element. Actionable in the sense that we're going to be using it in our very first workshops with external stakeholders. That step is setting a list of questions that we should be asking about Horizon 1. And naturally, I shared a list of questions that are typically used in Horizon 1, some ideas to start the conversation. So that's what we also started with on day 4, but it was a very good discussion, and it also showed some additional questions that we might need to answer very early in the process. But then we went through them and tried to contextualize them, tried to reformulate them in a way that would work for the local context. That took us some time, and we didn't manage to finish on day 3. And so day 4, as I mentioned, we finished the work on our questions, and we moved to the work plan risks and stakeholders. When discussing the 3 horizons, we talked about the persona that somewhat exemplify the horizons, but we also cleared a common misconception that it's only these personas that could be found in each of the institutions and each of the horizons. Sometimes people would say that within the system as usual, you only have administrators. You only have people who have the mindset of upholding the institution as it is. But that's not true. We all know that that is not true. In our institutions, we have all of these people. We have administrators, incumbents, we have visionaries, we have innovators and entrepreneurs. And so we talked about the fact that we will need to really understand who's who and start engaging a broad variety of different stakeholders into this process if we want to really reach a high level of buy-in, legitimacy, but also a very thorough understanding of different perspectives that shape the system, and then in time can really help us or hurt us along the way of designing the system that would be best for the Somali context. Most of the fourth day we spent on the very specific steps that we would be taking along the way. So that was a very practical discussion. We used Miro to take notes and modify different elements of the work plan. We also spent time discussing risks that might emerge on different steps in different phases of the process. Finally, we moved to stakeholder management. And for that, I just couldn't make a workshop that wouldn't mention Eric van Hippel, my absolute hero. And so we talked about snowballing and pyramiding as different ways of approaching stakeholder analysis. We talked about how exactly do we define different groups that should be part of our process. And naturally, we went through the stakeholder matrix. That's something that I'm sure you're familiar with, that helps us organize a little bit our thinking about who do we talk with, who do we consult with, who should be informed, who perhaps doesn't need that much information, but we still should keep them updated, and so on and so forth. And so the matrix, as you know, is across two different axes: an axis of interest of the stakeholder, how much the stakeholder is interested in a specific process, in this case, justice system strategy. The second axis is the influence of the specific stakeholder. There might be stakeholders, as you know, who have very high interest, but very little influence. And on the other hand, there might be stakeholders who have very little interest and yet very big impact on the process and the justice system as a whole. And so we discussed all of that. We planned our activities moving forward, and we basically wrapped up our 4-day session. The reflections after the session were very optimistic, and I was honestly very impressed by the resilience of the team. I didn't mention that at the beginning, but the workshops were taking place in the last days of Ramadan. That means that a big part of the team was waking up very early in the morning to pray for a couple of hours, then eat before sunrise, and then they would fast for the entire day. So there were no coffee breaks, no lunch breaks. We had to go through the entire material, recognizing that a big part of the team has very difficult context for actually staying focused and staying engaged. And yet they were. So I was very humbled. I was very impressed. And I really enjoyed working with the team. If you have any questions about the process, maybe there's an element that you would like me to unpack a little bit more, just drop me a comment below. If you like this video, I encourage you to consider subscribing and of course, liking the video. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.